Hello, I'm Emma Desi, and welcome to another episode of Turning Readers into Writers. If you're brand new here, welcome, and here's what you need to know. This is a community that believes you are never too old to write your first novel. No matter what you've been up to until now, if you're ready to write your book, I'm ready to help you reach the end. I focus on helping you find the time and confidence to begin your writing journey, as well as the craft and skills you need to finish the book. Each week I interview debut authors, editors and industry experts to keep you motivated, inspired and educated on all things writing, editing and publishing. If you want to catch up, head on over to emmadesi.com, where you'll find a wealth of information and tools to help you get started. Before we dive in, this week's episode is brought to you by my free cheat sheet, 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write. In this guide, I give you 30 ways that you can find time to write in the small gaps that appear between the various errands and tasks and responsibilities that you have in your day-to-day life. Now, you might be thinking that you don't have any time to spare, but I can guarantee these top tips will give you writing time you didn't think you had. If you thought writing always involved a pen and paper or a keyboard, think again. If you thought you needed at least an hour at a time to write your manuscript, I help you reframe that. You won't be disappointed. Get your free copy of 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write by going to emmadesi.com/30 top tips. Okay, let's dive in to today's episode. Susan DeFreitas is the author of the novel Hot Season, which won a Gold IPPY Award, and is the editor of Dispatches from Anarres, Tales in Tribute to Ursula Guin, forthcoming from Forest Avenue Press. An independent editor and book coach, she specialises in helping writers from historically marginalised backgrounds and those writing socially engaged fiction break through into publishing. So let's delve into this fascinating conversation with Susan and find out more how she uses fairy tales to write her socially engaged fiction. Susan, thank you so much for being here with me today. I'm delighted to chat to you.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Now, I always start my conversations with asking my guests, how did you get started in writing? What's kind of brought you to this point?
Yeah, I started writing fiction pretty much as soon as I could read it. I'm one of those people. So I started when I was 8 years old. I wrote, illustrated, ridiculous, mystery stories about cats that lived aboard ships. My dad was a chief engineer on a sailing ship. There were, in junior high, when I read fantasy and science fiction, I wrote my first novel. I believe it was, around 100 pages, but it was a big accomplishment for an 11-year-old. I won some little small town awards, and then I wound up, I had the wonderful opportunity to attend the Interlochen Arts Academy in Northern Michigan, which is a boarding school for the arts. And that is an experience that absolutely set my course. I discovered not only amazing, writers of fiction there, but the great poets, and it was really one of the most amazing years of my life. It set my taste for really top shelf fiction. And maybe, I just decided that's it. I want to do that more than anything else. And so, I majored in creative writing fiction in undergrad. And I was always writing a novel, always working on a book all through my 20s, regardless of what my day job or my gigs were, but it wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I went back to school and got my MFA and really centered writing in my life that way. Mm-hmm. And that's also the point where I became an editor first and then later a book coach. So you could say that it has always been with me, but maybe it took a while to become the main thing I was doing with my life.
Oh. Yeah. I'm always interested in the MFA programs and people who have taken them. What do you feel was your kind of main takeaway from doing that kind of either elevated or changed or enhanced your writing?
I came in with a very strong sense of the kinds of stories I wanted to tell. And I soon discovered that those stories were considered rather unconventional in their subject matter, being somewhat political. I write about the environment. I'm an environmental writer. And in centering characters many people had not seen in fiction before, among them activists. So there was definitely some, I would say, some tension there, because I had wanted this thing for so long and I'd been working on it for so long, but to discover, that maybe what I was so passionate about was considered perhaps marginal or outside the mainstream. But so, that's just being honest. That's just being very honest, in terms of many different people have many different experiences in MFAs, but that was definitely part of what I had to grapple with there. But a huge takeaway that I got, Emma, was how to distill one's prose. I call it professional strength prose. The author Matt Bell has this wonderful term for it: weasel words. They are words and phrases that are just not holding weight. They are just taking up space. They're taking up your word count. And I discovered this when one of my mentors there, David Long, you'd take a paragraph that I had written, and I swear to you, cut a third of the words out of it without changing a bit of the sense. Okay. And in fact, it read the way that I thought it read when I had sent it to him. And, maybe this is part of what really set me on my course of first working as an editor, because I saw what magic that was, especially when I started to read for literary magazines. I read for Tin House magazine, RIP. And I found what a difference it made, when I opened up a submission. I could tell right away. I call it professional strength prose, when the sense has been cooked down. I love to cook, so I think of it as it's a reduction. It doesn't taste of the original ingredients. It's this own unique, finely flavored, strongly flavored thing. Mm-hmm. And I really began to see that has so much to do with what makes work publishable. So that was a huge takeaway I got.
Okay, well, that's interesting you've said that, because I was thinking in my head when you were talking, I was thinking, it's turning words into an art form, which perhaps is not always the most accessible, but you're kind of saying, no, it's more publishable, which would kind of suggest that it is more accessible then when it's distilled in that way.
Yes. That's interesting, because certainly, some people take the poet's approach, and they do focus on that lyricism and those wild turns of phrase, but at its heart, this is a process that can apply to the most straightforward nonfiction writing there is. It's simply efficient, and it doesn't waste your time as a reader. And that communicates respect, for the reader's time. Especially with fiction, where it's not as if you're reading a how-to manual, on how to accomplish something in your life, like a self-help book or prescriptive nonfiction. Someone is asking you to pay attention to something they entirely imagined, while your kids need a snack and, the laundry's not done and you've got a text from your boss. Like, you really owe it to your reader not to waste their time and to communicate very clearly an authority that says, I have a story, I have something astounding to tell you. I have a secret. You must know what this is, and distilled prose plays a big part in that.
It gives me chills just you talking about it, that idea of this being something so special. I love it. Now, I've got slightly sidetracked. Okay. But I was very interested in what you were saying, but my next question was going to be, something I'd read on your website, and you described one of your professional values as being literary citizenship. And I wondered what that means for you.
You know, it is, it's a term that is, well in circulation these days in literary communities, and I'm happy to see that. And it means different things to different people, but one of the best ways I think I can characterize it is talking about some of the differences I've observed between the more academic MFA, literary circles and those associated with speculative fiction, which is one of my great loves, right? Science fiction and fantasy and all of its various derivatives, imaginative fiction. And what I saw in the more academic world, where people are, competing for those top prizes and really, in workshops with each other. Yeah, there's a tendency to be a little competitive, and with it, a real tendency to judge your work intensely based on that of others, and also to judge your fellow writers, their work, based on your standards and your ideas and your concerns, etc. And it's natural and it's human, but I'm not convinced that serves us, as people, as artists, or as a culture. And it was a revelation to me when I attended some of my first cons, as they're called. I was a presenter up at Norwest Con in Seattle, which draws a wide variety of fabulous. I mean, the Northwest is just lousy with amazing speculative writers. Stevenson, and of course Ursula Guin used to live there. God bless her. And she passed. I don't know if you heard it, just a few years back. And I'm actually in the process of editing an anthology in tribute to her work. Absolutely a writer who both literary and speculative. But what I saw in that community was that no matter how well published, no matter how many of the top awards, the writers there had won, they were fans first, right? And nobody was above, standing in the hallway, having a drawn out conversation with some young geek about the influence of Poe, on the genre, or Heinlein, or their love for, the C.J. Cherryh, or the feminist themes in Ursula Le Guin's work. And I thought, this is it. This is the ideal, right? Is that we are fans first and we are artists second. And the love and the passion that we have for the work that has inspired us and made us who we are, that is what we share with a 14-year-old kid who has just read the first book that lit their world on. And we are still those people, no matter how far we come, if we're just beginning, there's a kind of levelness to it that I found inspiring. And I thought, I will serve literary culture. Until then, I wanted so badly. Again, I'd started quite young, feeling like, oh, I'm a prodigy or whatever, because I was gifted or whatever. And I had disappointed some of my greatest hopes, by the time I was 30. And also went through these workshops where I learned that, my work really was not the genius thing that I had thought it was. But I thought, you know what? That's an illusion. That wasn't the goal to begin with. That's not what I should aim for. There is no lack of ways for me to be part of this conversation. So that's when I began reading, working as a reader for magazines.
Right.
It was also when I was learning my trade as an editor and learning to serve other writers in strengthening their work. I wrote book reviews, and so I really I began teaching, to a certain extent too, especially working with young people. I work every year teaching an institute at Interlaken during the summer program on the novel for teenagers with kids in junior high, teaching them about the uses of the imagination in fiction. I just began to see that it was so much bigger than my personal vision as an artist. And that has been the entire key to to establishing, honestly, the beautiful literary life that I have.
Oh, beautiful. Lovely. Well, talking of your literary life, your novel Hot Season was winner of the 2017 Gold Independent Publishers Association Award for Best Fiction of the Mountain West. So I wonder if you could tell us about the book and where the inspiration for it came from.
Sure, yeah. So I shared a little bit with you about my, the process of going through my MFA program. And, when I came into that program, I thought, I'm the kind of person who has far too many ideas for books. People who struggle for ideas, I find it amazing and mysterious that anyone has this problem. I have so many, I'll never be able to get to them all. But out of all possible ideas that I had, I thought, I'm just learning how to really write now. And workshops they tend to work better for short stories than they do for novels, right? Mm-hmm. So I will write a novel in stories. I was intrigued by the linked story form, which I'd studied in undergrad. And I thought, this is a way that I could sort of have my cake and eat it too. Even if the novel winds up being a complete train wreck, I figured I would still be able to take it apart and use some parts, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe still manage to publish a story or two, still manage to get a leg up that way. Because up till that point in my life, I had only published nonfiction and poetry. So I wrote a series of stories that was based on events in my own life and in the lives of people I knew at the time through my somewhat bohemian 20s, where I and a group of young people, all somewhat associated graduates of Prescott College. We were living in a certain neighborhood in Prescott. It was a barrio. It was a diverse neighborhood. And we were very concerned with ecological and environmental issues. Prescott College is known for its focus on the environment. So you study that regardless of whatever your subject matter is, regardless of whether you're going to school for creative writing or education or science. You study the environment and the human impact on it. So, my friends were artists. They were activists. They were people who wanted to be farmers. Small scale urban agriculture folks. And it was such an interesting and inspiring and at times ironic group of people to be around. Because we were all trying. We're all idealists, focused on these causes. We're also just young people making mistakes and, having romances and intrigues and all that. But the real inspiration for that first book came when, this is a true story, one of the alums from our school, he had started kind of an activist community center in town. And the place was raided by the FBI.
Oh.
And as it turned out, he was one of America's most wanted for having been part of a group responsible. They were known as eco-terrorists.
Okay.
Right?
Oh,
they had gone beyond activism and gone into what's called monkey wrenching, right? Where they had, during the 90s, they had done quite a lot of damage to a lot of, buildings and equipment owned by corporations that they had deemed to be, highly destructive to the earth. Among them, timber companies up in Eugene area. Anyways, that event was so dramatic. okay, and this is really, I get a little choked up thinking about this because this guy was a friend of mine, he was a friend of a lot of ours, but none of us knew this about him, his past. All of the people who had been part of the group that he had been part of, they were known as the family, and they were all anonymous in their identities with each other. They had all wound up serving life sentences in federal prisons where they remain. And so he was the last of the group to fall in that domino chain. And so rather than allow that to happen to himself, he took his own life.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
And it just rocked our community because it brought up questions about where do you draw the line in your commitment to the cause? Mm-hmm. And, yes, this is a matter of life and death in the long run for this planet, but how extreme are you, and how does temperament play into it? And all of these things make this book sound very serious and dramatic, but really my angle on it was that at that time I had two young roommates. I had graduated already. I had two roommates who were still enrolled in school, and they told me they got a message from the dean alerting the student body that undercover agents had been enrolled and were enrolled in classes. So imagine how that affected, undergraduate romances at this school where you don't know who is who. So I haven't told you much about the plot of the book at all, but I hope it's given you a taste. It's the really
story behind the story is just as good. Yeah.
Of this real life event. Yeah. Let's say it's a humorous story about some dark things or some serious things.
I am intrigued. I'm definitely getting myself a copy now. Okay, so that's that's come from some dark stuff, but it's a humorous story, you say. And do you is that a style of yours that you like using humor? Because you've also written around and about kind of fairy stories, and so do you bring your humor into those as well?
I really feel that I do work in very different forms. And I honestly would say, sometimes with the fairy tales, it'll creep in, but it's really, I suit my approach to my subject matter. And in that first book and the book I'm working on now, I told you I was working on linked stories. That was one manuscript that I then broke into 3 sections. And the first section became my first book. I'm now working on the next. For that project, as Vonnegut is in my ear, Tom Robbins is in my ear. Even Brodigan, who was more experimental, is in my ear. And those guys are all very funny. Ed Abbey and John Nichols, two icons of Southwest literature that are seldom read outside of this part of the US. They're both very, very funny people, who wrote about, the environment and about monkey wrenching and about, they took on that serious subject matter, environment, and the fight to save land and landscapes, from that humorous perspective. And so that's what came to me when I tried to write about these things. But when I write, right now I'm working on a series that's fairy tales that deal with climate change, right? That for those tales, I'm going to assume the tone of the classic fairy tales that I grew up with. They have a certain amount of repetition. They have a certain lack of embroidery about them. They have a certain, I guess, maybe implied humor, but there's also just a brutality in fairy tales, where
which I think we don't. I think these days we don't realize that everything's been Disneyfied so much.
Yes,
and I think I haven't studied it myself, but I believe if you go back to the originals, they're really, really dark stories.
Especially the ones Disney has mined the most, which are Grimm's. Grimm's are quite grim. Yeah. The tale I have up now, the 7 sisters, 7 ravens and their sister, that's there's a turn in the story where the heroine cuts off her own finger and uses it as a key to open a door. And that's the sort of unthinking violence that, fairy tales, it is the natural province of fairy tales to deal with the dark. And I feel like, with climate change, we're not good at thinking about the dark in a way that is not, sensational, in a way that isn't, the sort of turns you might see on television or movies, like it really like getting to the heart of, this is actually a feature of existence, that we are animals and we're subject to to these pains and horrors. And I think it suits the truths of climate change. We're just now starting to get hold of these, that things are coming down the line, big forces on par with the mythic, on par with our human history when there were still wolves and beasties at the door. I think we need these sorts of tales to prepare us, and not to get too grim, but to prepare our children. Because fairy tales in many ways have been our way of preparing our children for the dark truths of human existence. When you think about a story like Bluebeard, and the way, the young girl marries the Lord in his castle, and there's a room that is only one room's forbidden to her. When she opens it, she finds the dead bodies of all of his previous wives. There's a kernel at the heart of that is speaking to girls about the violence that is potential within romance and marriage. And so I'm just interested in the way that these forms might help us to prepare ourselves.
Yeah. I like that correlation you've made. It's easy to kind of look back and see that, okay, yeah, fairy tales served a purpose at a time when life was a lot harder, life was tougher, there wasn't too much pleasure going on, it was a hard grind. And I can see then that by taking fairy tales now and pushing them into the future rather than the past, and what might happen in the future if we don't heed the warnings that we're seeing coming now, that there's really good what's the word I'm looking for? It's giving imagery. I guess it's storytelling in a more accessible way, in a less moralistic way that we see on the news about telling us that we're doing everything wrong. But actually, through story, it's more engaging. We're more open to it, more receptive, and we can digest it in our own way, and then come to conclusions about, what does this mean for the future, for me, for my children, for my grandchildren. Because I was just talking to my husband about this the other day, just saying, we're all right, we'll be dead before all this happens, but it is the next 2 or 3 generations down that are going to bear the brunt of what we're doing, and the 2 or 3 generations before. So I hadn't seen fairy tales in that way before, so thank you for that. That's given me a whole new perspective on them. You mentioned before that you do write in many different forms, some long form like your novel, some more short and experimental. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about the different forms that appeal to you?
Oh, sure. Yes. I do write novels, and with the series that I'm working on now, again, I am taking linked stories and rewriting them as novels. But in so doing, part of what it's a maddening process, but part of what I really love about it is the way bits and pieces, chapters from other point of view characters remain in the novel, even though, in the revision, the protagonist has a clear arc. There is that rising action towards a point of climax. There is a main storyline. But because I wrote these as linked stories, they're almost asides. where another character will have a chapter in a way that provides insight on the main action or develops it. And so let's say that I'm enjoying the way that those things work together and continuing to work with that form in that series. I have on the back burner a more traditionally structured sci-fi novel dealing with artificial intelligence, although that moves back and forward in time in a certain way. I also write short stories, straight ahead, not linked stories. I have a collection I've been working on called Dream Studies. And one of my mentors in graduate school said in an assessment, Susan has a strong tendency towards formal experimentation. And I thought, I didn't know that about myself before, but it caused me to really embrace it. Even though the stories in Dream Studies are traditional short stories and they are not linked, the way that I came up with them, I was recovering from surgery and I really had to sit and just be, and not be at the computer too. So I sat in the backyard with my notebook and I had really been interested in the idea of aesthetic. What do you like? What do you just enjoy? I kind of had it with the grind of submission schedule in graduate school. It sucked some of the joy out of the process for me. So I wanted that joy back. And to me, aesthetic is where the joy lies, right? Mm-hmm. So I made a list of things. What do you like in your fiction, Susan? I like books about books. I like libraries. I like architecture. I like odd buildings. I like secret messages. I like notes. I could go on. I like dreams. Let's say that too. And I made a list of all these things. And Emma, what I did was that I just said, I'll pick this thing here, this thing here. I circled them and I came up with a plot for a short story. I did that. I came up with 12 plots in the course of 3 days. And then I spent the next 3 years just writing them. And so all of these stories, they mirror each other in these ways. Mm-hmm. These themes run through them in a way that I don't think would have arisen naturally, mm-hmm. or through a different process. So that's one thing. I also love flash fiction, uh-huh. And I have developed various different forms for it, much in the way, a sonnet is a form for a poem or a villanelle is. I thought, why not have some forms for flash fiction or the lyric essay? So I developed a number of those for my Patreon last year.
Okay, so I've been fascinated by this. So would you kind of expand on, particularly the one that you mentioned on Patreon is the Fibonacci spiral? Right. I wonder if you'd tell me about that.
Yes, it should be obvious, I'm a geek. Being a fan of science fiction. My father's an engineer. And I've always been fascinated by form and pattern in nature. And so a Fibonacci spiral, for those who don't know, it is a form that arises everywhere in nature. And in art too, it's a sort of spiral pattern that corresponds to the golden mean, which Da Vinci used in his in many of his paintings and is still used. It's a form that we tend to find beautiful. If you think of the pattern of a fern observes a Fibonacci sequence in the way that its small leaves become bigger, right? So a Fibonacci sequence is a number pattern in mathematics where the sum of each of the two numbers, well, the easiest way to explain it is say your first number is 0, right? And say your second number is 1. Add 0 plus 1, you get 1, right? Mm-hmm. But then for the next number, you add 1 plus 1, you get 2, right? Mm-hmm. 2 plus 1, you get 3. 3, you take the last two numbers and you add them, And what starts very small soon becomes exponentially much larger.
Okay.
Right. So, I'm not a mathematician and I'm not explaining it as well as I would like to, but I thought, well, why not apply this to word counts, and work in sections.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just set a title for a piece of flash fiction or a lyric essay, often based in a fairy tale, and set that the word count of the title as my first in the sequence.
Okay.
Right? And then I would reproduce that same number count in section 1. But then section 2, the word count would be the sum of the word counts of the title and the first section.
Right.
And so it starts off in practice, again, it's a bit of a game. Play it out, see how it goes. In practice, it winds up being that you sort of make a statement. You make a statement with your title, you make a statement with your first section, and then you elaborate on it. It grows to 2 sentences or 3. And before you know it, it ends, wherever you choose to end. Fibonacci sequence has no end. It just keeps, the numbers keep getting larger and larger. But wherever you choose to end, it has this sense of being a rush. Your words are tumbling over. What started very terse and very distilled then becomes this whole onrush of images and words and story that you're sharing. And in that, I felt like it almost felt like a conversation, especially with someone new, where you start off somewhat feeling each other out, but you become more comfortable. And before you know it, you're telling this long-winded, story from deep, in your childhood, and you're feeling so connected, or,
Mm-hmm.
it really, it was a thought experiment that when I played it out, I thought, this is fun and this is really interesting. And I'm just very fascinated by where this form can take me. So, again, with fairy tales, I've found it easy. I don't have to think too much about what to say, in part because my word counts are set for me. It occupies the part of the brain that's analytical. And I feel like it kind of keeps you from thinking too much about what you're writing, right? Disarming your inner editor. And, fairy tales are a subject that are so deep-seated for me that I can riff on them. I don't have to think too much about that either. Okay. So what has been unearthed through this process is often surprising to me. And I love that.
Oh, cool. Well, and people can find out about that on your Patreon account, can't they?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Very cool. I love it. Now did you mention it? But if not, I'm going to change tack again and talk more about what you kind of do now and what you do with other writers, which is predominantly coaching and editing. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. And so what kind of stories do you like to work with that other people are writing?
Yeah, that's a great subject. And I love that we have had this conversation about, all these experimental forms. Where we were chatting before this interview, I thought I was saying how it's somewhat ironic because so much of what I do is coach people through an understanding of traditional structure for the novel, to support them, in the pursuit of landing their first book deal, which is something I feel very passionate about, is helping people break through into publishing. So a lot of what I do, it is brass tacks, it is basics, but as I understand them, which, there are so many forms people talk about, right? Mm-hmm. And so many forms that are quite effective. There's 3-act structure. There's 4-act structure. In one of your previous interviews, you mentioned it's like a grid structure, right? There's the Save the Cat, which is derived from movies. There's the hero's journey, which is derived from mythic cycles. I think they are all fabulous, and they all work, if your story fits into one of those formats, you can take it to the bank because they are tried and true.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel very passionately about the fact that none of those structures will fit every story,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So my approach to coaching people and helping people as an editor with their novels is to focus on three fundamental things, okay, which I think are the broad spectrum, antibiotic. They will cure most of the ills that can afflict a manuscript. Okay, number one is plot, the causality of how one thing leads to another, and how tight they are in time, right? That's the pacing, right? How clearly connected how the story logic is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So number one, how the plot connects. Number two, the character arc. And I put that first, honestly, though most people think of plot first, because I'm a protege of Lisa Cron, great story coach. She's also one of my book coaching clients, and a good friend. I am a huge believer in what she has unearthed about the brain science of fiction, which is that it's not about what happens. It's about how it changes the protagonist. It's about who it happens to, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's about how it pushes the external events push the protagonist to grow and change and come to understand something that they did not before, come to understand, on a deeper level that something that they have held to be true is just not true at all,
mm-hmm.
right? Because that's where the emotional catharsis lies, in that realization, and it's also where we derive meaning from fiction, because that's the part that we can take for ourselves. The events of a particular story, we'll probably never encounter those events in our own lives, but that internal truth and that change in perspective, that's the part that we can use. That's the part that makes us wiser, stronger, better, more empathetic.
Mm-hmm.
That is really what we are reading for, whether we realize it or not. The plot's sort of the fireworks to capture your attention, right? This is the thing that we really read for. And then finally, the part that makes the story legible to the reader, which is the goals and motivations of the protagonist. If you don't know what somebody wants or what they're trying to achieve, you can't tell what's even supposed to be happening, right? So those are the big three that I focus on in my approach to structure. And what I love, the types of stories I love to work on are literary stories and speculative stories, and those that blur the bounds in between, But particularly, I love to work with writers from historically marginalized backgrounds. So that's writers of color, that's women, that's folks from the LGBTQ spectrum, differently abled folks. This is the time where we must hear those voices. Those voices must be in the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And as a writer of color myself, I am here for that.
Mm-hmm.
I am here to support that. And then also, just writers who actively seek to engage with the most pressing issues of our day, and that's sexism, that's racism, that's the environmental crisis, that's,
mm-hmm.
Poverty and, economic disparity. Like these, I do not accept that those are not subjects worthy of literature, of the best literature,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I am here to support writers doing that work and bringing them into the conversation.
Fantastic. And let me ask, do you see a change happening in the landscape that way? Do you see more people coming in from these different backgrounds, different experiences, and the kind of the subject matter of poverty, of environment, of racism, sexism? Do you see that growing and that we are kind of moving in the right way?
I feel that we are, but Emma, at this time, I feel that fiction is behind nonfiction. If you look at the the bestsellers in nonfiction, you know, these are books about, you know, here in the US, we have books like How to Be an Anti-Racist. You know, we have books like Elizabeth Wilkerson's Caste. We have Hillbilly Elegies, you know, dealing with the political split and the economic situation in our rural areas. You know, we are in the midst of a intense, you know, social justice movements, environmental justice movements. You know, that's what's happening in our culture right now. That's what's in the conversation. And nonfiction is getting there quicker than fiction. And that should be no surprise, because fiction takes longer to cook down. It takes longer to turn experience into the stuff of fiction, you know, to grapple with meanings, you know, and their impacts, these sorts of issues, impacts on the lives of real people and generations, you know.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising to me, but we need to get there. You know, writers, we need to get there. And if you are writing, you know, anybody writing any kind of story at this time, there is a way that your work can intersect with these issues. Whatever particular issue you are most passionate about right now, you can find a way to get there, you know, without changing in huge part, you know, your concerns or your approach, you know, and I encourage everybody to do that. But I think, you know, things are changing slowly, you know, partially in the publishing industry as we get more women in gatekeeping positions, as we get slowly more people of color in gatekeeping positions. Right now, it seems as if there's far more agents of color than editors, acquisitions editors. But, you know, I do, what I'm seeing and hearing from my agent friends right now is that part of what's getting sold and part of the shift is that, you know, we're still selling straight ahead romances, but, you know, their romances. I love the work of my client, Aya De Leon. You know, she writes a feminist romances that, you know, the protagonists are like former sex workers. You know, they're women of color. They're women from marginalized backgrounds. You know, she writes heists and thrillers where they're taking on, you know, they're robbing the rich white guys. They're funding public clinics, and this is straight ahead romance, or it's straight ahead thriller. I think that's so subversive and it's so brilliant, you know. And yeah, I was talking with a friend of mine who's an agent a couple of weeks ago. We were having Zoom drinks, and you know, she was saying, you know, what I'm looking for, what I've really been able to sell are, you know, the YA stories that are, you know, their own voices. You know, they have a protagonist of color or queer protagonist, or, you know, there's some angle. Again, it's not as if the whole structure has changed. There's still, say, a romance at the heart of it, or a coming of age, you know, but, you know, the kids might be activists, or they might be, there's all these different ways that these pressing issues of our day are now coming into fiction. And I think it's fascinating that it seems to be coming from genre. You know, genre is sort of taking a chance that way because, again, genre is like, it's form, right? Like I was talking about a sonnet or a villanelle. As long as you observe the dictates of form, you can kind of put whatever you want to in. You know, and I love the way that form, you know, traditional tropes are being subverted within genre fiction right now.
So that begs the question then, in the sort of literary circles then, why is it not happening there so much? Is it because of the people who are at the top in literary circles and making the decisions about what's bought and sold, that they are of a an older type.
No.
They're not diverse themselves, and so they're not interested in writing and reading about more diverse characters. I
can't really say exactly what it is. Some of it is that top shelf, literature is dominated by people who went through MFA programs. MFA programs have been pretty white, but beyond that, I received this signal very clearly, and I mentioned it a bit earlier. There is an unspoken element of academic creative writing workshops in this country that signals to the young writers who may be interested in particularly political issues that is not a proper subject for good art.
Okay.
It's changed a bit it's changed a good amount actually when it comes to racism and sexism, because those are so-called identity politics, right?
Right.
Or queer stories. Like if it is primarily about the individual, then yes, this has been allowed into the canon. And yes, now we have, these top shelf stories coming, books winning awards coming out about such things, but it's still very rare. I will point to Richard Powers' astounding book, The Overstory. That book breaks form in that it's not about just one protagonist,
Mm-hmm.
And its subject is the forest, and its role in human health, civilization, culture, well-being. There's no way he could tell that story in a more traditional way. And, if that had been his first book, I doubt he would have broken through with it,
Mm-hmm.
And I think, in many ways, it's time of people like him, whose credentials are unassailable, and who's so well established, I think are helping to broaden this idea of what you can write about, and still have it be considered great art, or high art.
Mm-hmm.
And, not to go on too much about it, because this is a subject I'm very passionate about too, but that signal that politics is not proper to literature is based in the origins of the U.S. MFA program, started the Iowa Writers Workshop, which was developed as a way to counter Soviet era propaganda, right? Because the USSR demanded of its artists that they propped up their political agenda. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. aesthetic was very consciously crafted to have nothing to do with that, to focus only on the individual,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I really think it's time to push back against that. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I'm getting down to my soapbox now.
Well, I'm just conscious of time, because it's a very, it's an emotive subject, and it's very kind of relevant here and now. So, but I am conscious of time. So I want people to find out more about you and where they can find out if they're interested in working with you, or more about your written work itself. Where can they find out about you online?
Well, the best way to find everything about me is on my website, which is just my name, SusanDeFreitas.com. You'll also find me on Patreon. I believe that's patreon.com/Susan DeFreitas.
Cool.
It might be reversed. It might be DeFreitas Susan. One of those. Go to Patreon.
I'll link to it.
In my name, you'll find me. That's where you'll find all my strange little fairy tales and Fibonacci spirals and such.
Yes.
Cool. And yeah.
Brilliant. That's lovely. Susan, I really appreciate your time and sharing so many of your thoughts and your ideas with me, and your experimental approach to the writing form. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for just a fabulous conversation.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found that helpful and inspirational. Now, don't forget to come on over to Facebook and join my group, Turning Readers into Writers. It is especially for you if you are a beginner writer who is looking to write their first novel. If you join the group, you will also find a free cheat sheet there called 3 Secret Hacks to Write with Consistency. So go to emmadesi.com/turning readers into writers, hit join. Can't wait to see you in there. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.